Welcome back to Timo's Dinky Detailing. Today's model is a Dinky 255 Mersey Tunnel Land Rover. So this is a Land Rover that was specifically designed so that it would go in the Mersey Tunnel. When you had a problem in the Mersey Tunnel, they didn't want to have a big fire engine in there. They wanted a small vehicle that could tow a car out or could attend to somebody who was injured or put out a fire. So this was the kind of vehicle that they came up with, and I discovered all that information from one of my viewers. So it's kind of a police, fire, wrecker, all-purpose vehicle for the Mersey Tunnel. Anyway, you can see the front bumper has been damaged. The sheet metal on the bottom has been bent up, which is typical of these toys. When they've been played well or played with very heavily, at least, they get bent up quite a bit. So that's going to have to be straightened out. So the first step here is I'm going to try and get these wheels off. And I've been watching online other methods of removing these wheels, and one of them is to put a punch in the center. The guy was able to punch the axle out. So I've got a right size punch, and I got my little hammer, and I've got a little bench block with a tiny hole in it, and it's not working. So give up on that. So then I go to this method. I did this before using a sanding drum, and I have these carbide bits, and it's not working very well. It's grabbing too much, and I would probably need a grinding stone so that it's a finer thing. So I give up on that, and I go to my surefire way, and that's to cut the axle off. And these are my pliers that I've cut the jaws off of and just left the last little bit of cutters, and that can get into tight spaces and remove these axles. So I'm going to have to replace the axles because now they're too short to put new mushrooms on or to drill them or anything. So now my latest way of doing these things, instead of drilling into this, and this is a model that goes really well in the lathe of the milling machine because it's all rectangular, but I'm finding it's pretty easy to use the carbide bit and take these rivets off, and sometimes the rivet or the Dremel tool get out of hand and they can scratch up the bottom, but I think I did a pretty good job on this one. And I just take off enough so that the sheet metal will come out from the rivet off of the post. So there it comes off, and then that leaves part of the post there to register with those holes in the sheet metal. So you can see all these parts are bent up and they're a little bit rusty. So first thing, even before stripping paint, I'm going in with my parallel pliers, parallel flat jawed pliers. You can buy these actually. You can buy them flat jawed or with the teeth. And I bought these when I was an apprentice, and I ground the teeth off of them. I didn't know that there was ones that already had the jaws ground off. So you can bend some things. Other times you've got to go in and hammer the sheet metal. It's amazing how easy it is to hammer a piece of sheet metal flat. You wouldn't think it works, but it works brilliantly. So I got this one in pretty good shape. I think after this I still did a little bit of work, but it's mostly there. And I tested out on the casting to make sure that it's fitting in, and it looks pretty good. So now I decided, I noticed that it's a rectangular model, so I put it in the milling machine at least to start this hole. But I'm finding that it's pretty easy to drill out the post with a hand drill on the bench because it's a very small hole. And here this is that was a tap drill for a 440 screw, and this is a 440 spiral flute tap, and the spiral flute lets you go into a blind hole, and you can see the swarf comes out the top instead of being pushed down to the bottom. So that's the type of tap I'm using now. and then I go and put a screw in there. So the screw is there so it protects all the junk from going into it. Usually I wind up painting those screws and use the painted screw to go back in afterwards. So now it's time for stripping the paint. I put boiling water and caustic soda. There's no good paint strippers available anywhere in Canada that I can tell, and so I have to use the caustic soda. Now the base, these bases we've talked about before. I think that they were blued in the factory, like gun bluing, and so it doesn't really come off quite right with a paint stripper. But when you put it into the rust remover, it has a better chance. Now here I'm trying to bend that front bumper, get that straight, and I decided it's too much of a bend. I'm going to have to heat it up. Sorry that's out of focus. I had to turn the light off because otherwise you couldn't see the flame. I'll put the light back on, and that moves much easier. So now I've got to make a piece that's going to replace the part that's missing. So I've cut a piece of aluminum, and I'm basically being like a blacksmith with this. I'm going onto the vise and I'm hammering away and getting it to the shape that I need it in. And really, I can understand how blacksmiths work, because working with aluminum like this, you're hammering it, it's just like hammering red hot iron, except it's cold, so I can hold it with my bare hands. It's a tricky part because it has this little curve, and so I got that curve in there. And here it's still too long. I haven't cut it to length. I was thinking I would file it at an angle, and it's not liking filing. So okay, let's just file it straight, and I'll cut the part shorter to match. So filing off a bit of that's where it's going to be glued onto, so I have to make sure that it fits properly. So now I've got it fitting properly. So I'm ready to glue it in place. So somewhere in between, I managed to break off that little piece of bumper. So all that work hammering away came to waste. And now I'm taking off the remaining part of the bumper, and I'm going to put a brand new bumper on the front, the entire length, which I probably should have done from the beginning, because it's not going to be easy to just create that portion of a bumper. So there I've got just the post sticking out, and after all that work of making that little hook, I'm not doing it again. I'm just going to put a straight bumper without the extra support. It's not likely to be used as a toy anytime soon, so it should be strong enough for a display case. So I've put cyanoacrylate glue, also known as super glue, and that's the rapid setter of the glue. It's instant spray on instant setting of cyanoacrylate glues. And on the bottom I put a little bit there, and then some baking soda, which creates a structure to hold that bumper in a little bit stronger. So last week, Andrew Price at Maple Leaf Customs showed us a paint mixer using a tin can. I wanted to make one, but I didn't have any tin cans handy, but I had some 3-inch ABS, and I bought a plug, and basically you put the plug on the end of the ABS and you make a paint mixer. It's a little bit more durable than a tin can, so I'm happy with that. So I'm going in to the spray booth, and I've got my pink primer, and I'm going on top with a red paint. It's a spray bomb paint, and again spray bomb for the base. So the base gets satin finish black, and the wheels, they got primed and painted red, because that's the way it is on that model, that the wheels were red and the body was red. Now I'm using my new method for making axles. I've put a collet and a collet spacer into this collet block, and I'm just using it as a clamp for holding this piece of hollow tubing, and it's 2mm tubing, so it's the same diameter as a Dinky or a Corgi axle for their toys, for most of them. And the trick is, I used to drill holes in the end of these axles. Now I'm just going to mark off the length, and I don't need to drill a hole in the end because it's a tube. It's got a hole already there. So I'm cutting this to the correct length that I marked from the original axle. I'm just using that collet block. You could use anything to clamp this thing in. I made a video for showing how to do the whole job, and I'm just repeating it here, and it'll be in many of my videos in the future. So I'm squaring off the end and taking a burr off of it, and my axle is already ready. That was very, very quick. And then I've got these little nails. They're domed nails, and these ones have a bronze finish, but they're steel nails, so I can get that bronze finish off, I figure, with the buffing wheel. And I was thinking it's a thin finish and it should come off easily, and sure enough, it took about 2 seconds. Then I lightened a little bit the polish on the end of it, so it looks perfect. So then, to make up my starting axles, I'm just putting the one mushroom on the end, and I'm using a Leans. This is the glue I've used before. It's a craft glue, and it's tacky right away, so when you put something there, it stays put until the glue dries. The glue dries quite quickly. In this case, though, I did it the day before I was going to put the model together, or at least put the wheels together. So the hook, all of these models usually have the hook bent. It's been in the toy box and thrown in the toy box, and that hook eventually gets bent, even though it's a pretty sturdy hook. So I just straightened it and gave it a coat of black satin finish paint. Now this one's getting the Mersey tunnel decals, and I designed these myself to match as closely as I could the original ones that are barely visible under the original paint job that I got. I think it was repainted. So this is just the white, and I also printed in yellow. It's the only way I'm going to make these things yellow, because you can't align the yellow on a separate print from when you print the white. And it took me a long time to try and align this, because you can't really see properly where the letters are. Once they go over the red, it's hard to see them. So I pushed it around back and forth and spent quite a bit of time. Eventually I got them somewhat reasonable. They're not perfect, but when you look at the original models, they seem to have a little bit of white showing around the yellow. So I think it kind of matches the original flaw that was in those decals. So the back one, I printed the yellow because it has a black mat around it. I just had a yellow area that's smaller than that black mat, and it's close enough so that through the printer twice it does align close enough that it fills the entire space and it doesn't peek out from the edges of the decal. So I wanted to make an interior, so I went in the computer and I printed up my own interior and 3D printed it. And I made kind of a faux steering wheel, because I really don't like trying to get those steering wheels into a tiny little hole. So it kind of put it in there. It doesn't, if you look closely, it doesn't look right, but I figure from through the window, probably going to look okay. So now putting these wheels back on, the axles, I had done the one end, so that's as if you had taken your axle and drilled holes in the ends, but I didn't have to do any of that hard work. And then I take my 5-minute epoxy and I quickly mix it up. You got to mix this stuff really well or it's not going to harden properly. But this stuff from the dollar store is actually way better than the expensive stuff that has a gorilla on it. So I'm happy paying a fraction of the price. And there we go. Perfect finish. Now for this, for the seats, I printed it. I think I printed it twice to make adjustments, but I still didn't get the height right. But I've learned from other models that sometimes Dinky would put a sponge underneath the seats so that it would push it up into the cabin. So that's what I've done, is I glued some sponge onto the bottom. And here, making a very, very simple windshield. I scored the plastic so that I could bend it. And when I'm working with this stuff, it drives me crazy because it's best to work with your bare fingers because it's tiny and it's very delicate. But you get your fingerprints all on it. And what I did was I just went to the sink and washed it with soap and water, and then held it by the edges so it doesn't have any fingerprints when it's in the final video. So now I take those screws out. They've been painted red along with the rest of the model. I've got my sponge on the bottom of the interior, and I have to put that interior in there because the back window actually fits in behind the seat back, so it has to be in there just right. And then I align my base, and it works perfectly, and the hook goes back on as well. And it's just a matter of screwing in 2 screws. So now the model is together, and I can put the final touches. I've started doing most of the detailing at the very end when the model is already assembled, because I find I'm handling the model too much, and these detail paints, particularly the silver, it doesn't do well if you get your fingerprints all over it. So I'd rather do that at the very end so that it's pristine in the final model. After painting these headlights, I used a tiny bit of thinner on the paint, try and get it to flow smoother, and I used a little bit too much. Then I said, okay, I know it's too much. I'm going to have to repaint it after it dries, but I'm going to make it all even, and then when I repaint it, it'll all be even when it's repainted. So here you see the first coat doesn't cover properly, and then magically it's all covered perfectly. And then I use my dot painter. These are dot painters. They're for painting fingernails, and it's for making dots. And it's brilliant. It's just a little metal ball. So let's remind you where we started. So here's our Mersey tunnel emergency truck, a Land Rover, and a beautiful one at that. It's in a little bit rough shape, needs to be painted up, needs to have repair to the bumper. So let's see what it looks like now. That looks like a right proper toy. Much as it looked when it was brand new, except it didn't have an interior. So this is basically a restoration to the original, except for the interior that I put in. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Timo's Dinky Detailing. Until next time, be seeing you.